Hi guys, so today I'm going to be giving a summary of everything I spoke about in the last 4 weeks. If you do get a chance to watch the other weeks, then do, but if not, then this is going to be a very brief, a very broad summary of everything we spoke about before. So slide 2 just shows you what we're going to be covering today. First of all, I'm going to talk about how sound works and how we hear. Then I'm going to talk about how the market reacted to the physics and the psychoacoustics of our hearing. Then I'm going to talk about how air sound works. So slide 3, introducing the first topic, how sound works and how we hear. Slide 4, sound is the vibration of air particles, and I think the best way to illustrate this is if you were to imagine a slinky and I was to stretch it out a bit and I was to nudge it from one side, you'd see a wave propagate down that slinky backwards and forwards, gradually losing amplitude until you couldn't see that vibration traveling anymore. And this is quite a good analogy because if you to look at the individual coils of the slinky, they don't move that far. What does travel is the propagation of that vibration along the slinky's length. And the same is true of air. If you look at the individual air particles, they don't move that far. What does travel the distance is the entire wave. Now, if you were to also consider how fast that individual air particle was moving backwards and forwards, this would be the rate of its vibration or the rate of its oscillation, and we usually use the unit of hertz to describe that rate, and hertz simply means cycles per second. It doesn't have to necessarily be to do with audio or sound, it just describes the rate of oscillation of something that is oscillating. In terms of human hearing, humans can hear from 20 times a second to 20,000 times a second when it comes to the vibration of air particles, that is. Slide 5 illustrates this range of human hearing and beyond in a frequency spectrum. You can see the piano notes that aren't grayed out are the ones that are actually on a piano. Either side of that are the piano notes that don't actually exist on a piano, but that would kind of be where they would be if they were real. Right at the left-hand side, you've got subsonic frequency ranges. Subsonic frequency range. These are the sounds that we can't hear. We might be able to feel them, but we can't hear them. We can't pitch them. We can't sing along to them. And this ranges from 0 hertz up to about 20 hertz. Above 20 hertz, between 20 hertz and about 40 hertz, you've got the very low bass frequency ranges. So this is the range that is useful for sounds like thunder, explosions, rumbles. Things that are good for a low frequency effects channel or an LFE channel on a cinema or surround system, but not that useful when it comes to listening to music, really. And a lot of the time those kind of sounds do start to rattle things in the house, so they can be a little bit distracting and annoying at times. Above that, between 40 hertz and about 160 hertz is the bass frequency range, and this is actually the range pretty much of the A70 subwoofer, and we chose that because this is the real musical bass exists in the frequency range. Above that, and I'm going to kind of lump these all together, between about 160 hertz and right up to about 3 or 4 kilohertz, you've got the mid-frequency range, and that is split up into low mids, mid mids, and upper mids. And these are all, this is just the stuff in the middle. So it's most of the information. Human babies tend to cry at a frequency of about 4 kilohertz, and that's actually where human hearing is most sensitive. The suggestion is that it's an evolutionary adaptation so that we can hear a baby crying, which is obviously quite annoying today, but it's probably key to human survival back in the day. If you can hear your baby crying, you're more likely to give it aid if it needs it. Above that mid-range is the high frequency range, or treble. So when you're using your Orbit Sound remote, when you boost the treble, you're boosting the high frequency range here, everything above 5 kilohertz really, up to 20 kilohertz and beyond, but we can't really hear beyond 20 kilohertz. In fact, if you can hear 20 kilohertz, you're doing very well, and you're probably under the age of 20. And when you use the Orbit Sound remote and you're boosting your bass frequency range, you are boosting that level below 160 hertz down to about 40 hertz. Everything in the middle is kind of left as it is, but you can still adjust the relative level of the mid frequencies by, say, taking the treble and the bass down. You're almost boosting the mid-range effectively. So that covers the frequency spectrum and relates it to your Orbit Sound remote. And also the A70 subwoofer. Slide 6, I want to talk a little bit about room reflections and coloration. When I use the word coloration, what I mean is anything that affects the Color of the sound. We use the word color because we often use descriptive words like bright or dark or warm when we're talking about sound. So we use these kind of descriptive words to describe sound, and they're quite rich in color. So that's why we use the word coloration. And it's anything that really describes something that affects the sound in terms of its frequency, range, and its reproduction. And one of the things that can affect the coloration of sound is room reflections. And we've got a diagram here. On the left, they're all horizontal reflections off walls, and on the right, there's the reflections off the floor and the ceiling. And when you're listening to sound from a loudspeaker, you're going to get sounds that are direct from the loudspeaker, i.e. sounds that don't reflect off anything but arrive directly at your ears. But you're also going to get sound that doesn't come directly to you but will take a path that's a bit longer and reflect off either 1, 2, 3, however many walls before it reaches you, or ceilings or floors. So when sound does arrive at your ear, it's going to combine, and you get what's called constructive and deconstructive interference. And this is where the waves interfere with each other and combine to give you your resultant wave. And when this happens, you tend to get a certain degree of coloration. It's generally not that serious, and our ears are quite good at adapting to a room in a way that isn't going to leave you feeling like, oh God, this sounds dreadful because of all these room reflections. Our ears are quite good at adapting to the room we're in. It's really a matter of degree. In your average living room, it's not really going to be a problem. So I'd say you can kind of live with it. But this is what people are trying to treat when they are spending money on acoustic treatment like absorptive materials for the walls or bass traps for the corners. They're trying to reduce the amount of indirect sound that arrives at your ears. So that really covers that. So slide 7, how the market reacted to these facts. Well, again, it was very brief and I only covered the things that I think are most critical to know about. But the first thing I want to talk about is lossless and lossy codecs. What I mean by codec is it stands for coding, decoding. So it's anything that takes a sound wave, encodes it in a certain file format, and then when you listen to it, it decodes it and it allows you to hear it as it was before the coding. And there are two types, lossless and lossy. Lossless codecs are all the codecs file formats like WAV and FLAC, and these leave the quality of the original information in the audio untouched. And when I say information, I basically mean everything useful to our ears. There are going to be sounds that we can't really hear. I wouldn't describe that as useful information, but regardless, everything in a lossless codec is left untouched, so we really experience the audio as it was recorded. There's no difference between FLAC and WAV if they're recorded at the same quality, even though the file sizes are different. They're just ways of encoding data efficiently, or in different ways in terms of the efficiency. So say you had a long string of zeros, because digital sound is represented in ones and zeros, you could represent, say, 10 zeros as an instruction to say, well, rather than giving you every zero, they're just going to say, we're going to get 10 zeros, and it takes less time to encode that than it would to encode all of those zeros. So they're just different ways to encode data more efficiently. The file sizes are much larger than lossy codecs, so a WAV file for an equivalent song for an MP3 would be much larger, maybe up to even 10 times larger. And they can also be much larger than is audibly necessary, i.e. you wouldn't necessarily be able to hear any difference between a 192 kilohertz 24-bit WAV file and a 44.1 kilohertz 16-bit WAV file. And this is where you get certain companies selling things that reproduce high-definition audio. It's really not going to be much use to the human ear because we simply cannot hear the difference. So anyway, examples of lossless codecs include CD, WAV, FLAC, or it might be described as PCM, pulse code modulation, and one example that would be 192 kilohertz 24-bit sound file. Moving on to slide 9, I'm going to talk about lossy codecs now. So these are MP3s, AAC files, OGG Vorbis, which is the format that Spotify uses, or when you're streaming from your mobile phone to your speaker with Bluetooth, you'd be using Bluetooth SBC or aptX. It might actually be that you have an MP3 on your phone and you're streaming in Bluetooth via Bluetooth, in which case you're using an MP3 file, which is then re-encoded into SBC, which is subband coding, and then that's transmitted over Bluetooth and then decoded back to MP3 and then decoded into your sound, what you actually hear. So the principle behind lossy codecs are that they remove only what is not necessary in the audio in the first place. And these are based off psychoacoustic models, so how we hear. One example would be masking. So if I was to scream at you now, you might not hear my cat in the other room meowing. That would be an example of masking. So what they can do is, even though the cat meowing would be part of the sound file, if you can't hear it, you can actually remove that information. So that's one example of how a psychoacoustic model might act to reduce how much information is in the original sound file. If you can't hear it in the first place, there's no point having it in the file. So that's the principle behind lossy coding. The trouble is that you can only remove so much from the audio before it does become audibly degraded. For example, if I'm screaming at you and there's also a truck outside and I remove the truck, you might start to hear the fact that I've removed the truck because I wasn't completely masking the truck in the first place. So there is a point at which you can't remove information from the audio before it starts really affecting the quality of the audio. So when you have low quality MP3s, they're kind of trying to remove so much information that you end up really hearing the detrimental effects of that level of compression. Read anything you want on that slide. I think I've covered everything that I think is important so far as lossy and lossless codecs are concerned. Slide 10, mono. Okay, so mono came about and it was the first instance of audio. I've got an example of it here with two loudspeaker drivers. This isn't a stereo system though, and mono really doesn't apply to how many loudspeaker drivers you're using. It's describing how many channels of audio you're listening to. So mono was in existence when audio first came about, say late 1800s, yeah, so as I said, here we've got two loudspeaker drivers in a box, but they're being fed by a single channel of audio, and when you're listening to it, you're sat there, it doesn't matter where you are in respect to the source, you're still going to be getting that same single channel of audio. So that would be what a mono system is. You get mono streamed from the radio sometimes, and most of the time when you're listening to just a presenter's voice, that's just going to be a mono channel. If you're listening to mono in stereo, what's going to happen is they're going to split that mono signal up into two equal channels, and you're going to be listening to the same audio coming through two speakers. So even if you've got more than one speaker set up, you're still listening to a single channel of audio. Stereo came about with Blumlein in England at Abbey Road, EMI, and this implementation uses two channels of audio and relies on their reproduction being from two separate speaker systems spaced apart from each other, towed in, i.e. angled inwards towards the listener, and separated by 30 degrees off the center line, so 60 degrees between the two speakers. Now the trouble with stereo is that it relies on phantom imaging. Now what this means is that for things that are meant to come from between the speakers, i.e. directly in front of the listener, sound is going to be reproduced equally from both speakers. And when this happens, you create what's called interaural level and interaural time differences between the ears. If something is equally placed, then there are no interaural differences, so the sound appears to come from between the speakers. So this would be a phantom image in that it's not real. Ghosts aren't real. Phantom images aren't real. There's no speaker in the middle reproducing that sound, but our brain creates a phantom image between the speakers. Now the trouble with this is that we've now got two speakers reproducing the same sound. We've got two ears listening to both speakers, and the sound from the right speaker arrives at the right ear first. Shortly afterwards it arrives at the left ear. The sound from the left speaker arrives at the left ear first. Shortly after it arrives at the right ear. So you get this interference between the sound, which results in that coloration that I spoke about earlier. But this is the principle of stereo, and if you're sat right in the middle, then you get the best balance between the speakers. The trouble is as soon as you move off center, either to the left or to the right, this effect called Haas effect kicks in, and that's H-A-A-S, and basically, in very basic terms, what it means is that our brain will collapse the psychoacoustic image that we had before, i.e. the phantom image, down into the nearest sound source. This is again The idea is that it's an evolutionary adaptation, in that what we're most interested in is sound that is coming from what's nearest to us, the nearest source of sound. So if there's a number of lions trying to kill us, the one we're going to perceive as being closest is going to be the one that's probably going to be putting us in the most imminent danger. So as soon as you move off center from when you're in listening to a stereo system, the sound is going to collapse into that nearest speaker. And this is a real problem for stereo, because it means that you're reliant on listeners sitting in what's called the sweet spot. To cover surround sound now, surround sound, the most obvious implementation of surround sound is 5.1, the most common is 5.1. 5.1 really describes the number of top channels, 5, and the number of subwoofer channels, 1. You can have any combination of those you can possibly imagine. You can have 22.4, you can have literally anything. But the most common is 5.1, and in this implementation you have a front left channel, a center channel, and a front right channel. You also have a surround channel off to your left and a surround channel off to your right, and you can see from the diagram here the relative positioning with respect to the listener. 30 degrees, 30 degrees, same as a standard stereo system for the front left and front right, and then 110 degrees for the surrounds. Now, the real benefit of a surround system is that you've got a center channel. So for all the dialogue, all the critical information that really makes up the majority of what we're listening to is going to be coming from directly in front of us. So when you're listening to a pop song, you're going to get the main vocal, you're going to get the snare, you're going to get the bass guitar, you're going to get the bass drum, you're going to get everything that's really central to the song coming through that center channel. So the great advantage of a surround system is that you don't need to rely on phantom images in order to get that critical central image. And if you were to move off center in a surround system, everything that was panned centrally, all those central images will still be coming from the center or underneath your TV. Sound will still start to collapse into the left or right channel, depending on what's coming through those channels. But this is the real advantage of a surround system. The trouble with surround system is that everything that isn't panned centrally, i.e. images that are panned between the left and the center, or the left and the surround, are going to be phantom images, so they will collapse. And if you move off center, you're going to start to hear sounds very distinctly coming from the surround channel, and also the front left if you're off to the left. The rear channels are predominantly used for ambient, so what's coming through those surround channels tends to be background sounds like effects. Say you're in a church, you'd have the ambience of the church and the reverberation in the church coming through the surround channels. Occasionally you get real panned sources coming through there. If you're watching a film and there's a helicopter moving overhead, you might hear that helicopter kind of go from central to right to surround right. It's quite distracting when that happens, especially because the sound will jump quite suddenly between the front and the rear, and it will collapse into each of those speakers quite easily. It can be quite distracting to listen to. So most of the time it's just ambience and effects that are kind of reproduced through the surround channels. Virtual surround sound, slide 13, is the idea that you haven't actually got speakers placed around you or behind you, but you're producing the effect that they are coming from there, and that's a virtual effect. It's not real because there aren't actually speakers behind you. In a sense, air sound is a virtual surround sound system because it gives you the sense that sound comes from all around. It gives you a great sense of envelopment and immersion in sound, but there aren't actually speakers behind you. But the traditional implementation of virtual surround sound relies on technologies like wave field synthesis in order to create the illusion that there are sounds behind you or coming from around you. And the image that's on the slide here is for a wave field synthesis system, and it's similar with other brands that use virtual surround systems. You'll have an array of loudspeaker drivers placed in a say a sound bar, and these will produce a number of different sounds and use a lot of processing in order to steer sound in certain directions, bounce them off walls, and so on. So it's a technology that relies very heavily on digital signal processing to such an extent whereby you're not really listening to the original audio anymore, you're listening to a heavily processed version of that audio. It relies on you generally being sat in the right place, and it relies on generally the environment around you being predictable. especially for virtual surround systems that aren't complete, i.e. in the one that you can see in the slide, that's a whole array of loudspeakers from left to right covering the span of the entire room. That's probably quite a good implementation of a virtual surround system. In reality, when you buy a virtual surround system, say from a retailer, you're going to get a virtual surround system in a soundbar that's probably about this big, and that's a hugely compromised version of a virtual surround system, which won't work particularly well from the outset, let alone when you've got people sat off center, people opening doors, people walking in and so on, and disturbing the sound field. So that's virtual surround system. It's highly flawed in most instances, and it's not very good at reproducing what's generally would be described as a natural sound. So air sound, finally, depicted here, we've got a system with a central loudspeaker facing forwards, and that reproduces left plus right, or the middle channel. You've got a loudspeaker facing sideways, which is reproducing left minus right, and you've got a loudspeaker in the opposite direction, reproducing right minus left. This is a very simplified description of air sound. And that brings us on to our final topic, slide 15, air sound. This is going to be a simplified description of how air sound works. In reality, there's a bit more going on, but I'm just going to cover it very, very briefly here. So slide 17, what does it mean? Well, left plus right is actually the mono image, and when you listen to a surround system, what's coming through that central loudspeaker is left plus right. The same as with an air sound system, what's coming through the front of your soundbar is left plus right. So this is the sum of the left and right channels from a stereo recording. So left plus right is the mono image, and these again the most important elements in the sound, like the dialogue or the singing, the snare drum or the, I don't know, the saxophone solo, whatever. And it is reproduced in an air sound system by a dedicated sender channel, like in a surround system. And as such, the most critical elements of what you're listening to are not reliant on you being sat in the sweet spot. And so it doesn't matter where you are in the room, you're going to get that critical information coming through a dedicated sender channel. There's not going to be much interference because you've only got one speaker reproducing it. It's not reliant on a phantom image as it is in a stereo system. So left minus right and right minus left, well, these are the difference channels, and they're called the difference or the side channels because they are the difference between the left and the right channels in the stereo recording. Now, the left minus right and right minus left are reproduced by the side drivers in the side of the soundbar, and it contains all of the information that is generally spatial or ambient or reverberation or effects or hard panned images that would have been panned off hard left or hard right in a stereo system. If you were to just listen to the side channel, it would sound quite bizarre. It's not a very natural sound. But in combination with the left plus right coming through the middle, you get a very coherent and stable experience of sound, which is not just great in terms of achieving all of the critical elements uninterfered with and natural, but you also get that ambience and the immersion coming out as a result of the side channels. So slide 18, how it sounds. Well, as I said, you get a stable center image wherever you are in the room. This central image is clear and without interference because it's not a phantom image, it's actually reproduced by a real speaker. And you get the spatial imaging recreated by the side speakers, and this results in great ambience, envelopment and stereo imaging. When we did research at the University of Surrey, we found that compared to an ideal stereo system, and this was a stereo system comprising studio-grade monitors, so a very good implementation of stereo, traditional, spaced off to 30 degrees left and right. Compared to a soundbar, we actually recorded superior ambience, envelopment and immersion with the air sound system than we did in the stereo system for various listener positions, both central and off-center. You've got no sweet spot, so it doesn't matter where you listen, where you sit and listen to your sound, and this is great for social instances where you've got, say, a party or you've got a group of friends listening and watching a film, for instance. It doesn't matter where they're sat; they're all going to experience the same experience. You've got good all-round dispersion. One thing I didn't speak about today, but I have spoken about in previous weeks, is the idea that even if you've got a single speaker, high-frequency sounds, treble sounds, tend to be beamed straight in front of the speaker, and if you were to sit off axis and listen to that single speaker, it would sound slightly more muffled depending on how far off axis you went. Now, with an air sound system, you've got loudspeakers facing sideways, the side speakers, so even if you were start to move off center from the center channel, you get a lot of those high frequencies filled in by what's coming out of the side channel. So you get good all-round dispersion. So even if you are sat off axis or off center, you're still going to get a great balance of sound in terms of the full frequency spectrum. One thing you can hear from the side channel are the MP3 artifacts, and so the more you compress sound, the more you listen to low quality lossy codecs, the more you're going to hear all those detrimental effects of high levels of compression when it comes to MP3s or AACs or whatever. I wouldn't say that that's a bad thing. I would say actually you're more able to appreciate the full quality of your audio with an air sound system than you are with a stereo system. So other benefits, and these tend to be quite practical benefits, is that it's a single box solution. You only need one single box for an air sound system, and it's particularly applicable to, say, portable speakers like with the Space 360, where you haven't got much space. You've got a small speaker. You can't space the speakers off in different positions in the room. It's got to be very compact. You can achieve your full stereo effect from a very compact solution. It's easy to set up because, again, you've only got one box. It's social, as I said. You can sit people anywhere in the room, and because there's no sweet spot, it's a social experience. There's only one source per channel, so the interference both between speakers is minimal, and also the interference in terms of room reflections is minimal. So actually, when it comes to an air sound system, there is less need. I would argue there isn't much need for a stereo system anyway, but there's still less need, even more so, for an air sound system to not go crazy with room treatment. In fact, air sound systems don't fight the room, they work with the room. And finally, I've got cost effective. Again, because you're not having to buy 5 top speakers and a sub, it's more cost effective. You can achieve what I would describe as, to some extent, a virtual surround system from a single box. Now, the last slide here, slide 20, what is best? Well, I've got everything that Orbit Sound products have with a gold star, everything that surround or stereo products have with a black star, and everything that surround or stereo products don't have with a red cross. And so here, just to go through these, I've got envelopment. Well, okay, both Orbit Sound products and surround or stereo products can provide that. Same with ambience. Same to an extent with fidelity or balance of sound. I would say that you get more interference with a surround sound system and a stereo system than you do with an Orbit Sound system. So in that sense, I think the fidelity and the balance of the overall sound is better with an Orbit Sound system. In terms of stereo imaging and localization, you can get that both with an Orbit Sound product and a surround sound or stereo system. Seating flexibility is the first one that really Orbit Sound products definitely have and the competition doesn't. The same is true of the ease of setup. It's so easy to set up an Orbit Sound soundbar. It's not so easy to set up a surround system or even a stereo system. And also cost, again, it's going to be more cost effective to set up a single box solution than a multiple box solution. So I think that very broadly describes everything that I went through over the last 4 weeks. If you can watch the last 4 weeks, then do. This is the briefest and most efficient summary of everything that I talked about that I can think of. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for listening.